we're just waiting to see who shows up here. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and begin. I'm Karen Harper. I'm the president of the Nashville Jung Circle. And we want to welcome you on this first day of spring. It is a gorgeous day here in Nashville. And so we appreciate you taking your time to be with us, and maybe get outdoors later if you haven't already. So I want to introduce Adele Tyler. She is going to be presenting or leading the book discussion today on part 2 of The Earth as a Soul.
Unmute.
That's what Clown was saying.
If your daddy comes and gets it for, wait a minute, tell your daddy to come here.
Come
If
here.
we could mute, that would be, I'm just going to do that. Okay. So Adele is, I'm going to have to read this. She's got quite a lengthy bio. She is a founding board member and past president of the Nashville Jung Circle. And she has been a student of Jung's for over 30 years. She has a master's degree in sociology. She's a certified life coach and Myers-Briggs consultant. And she's also led workshops and taught evening classes at the University School of Nashville on aspects of Jungian psychology. So, and if you would today, please keep yourselves muted until there is a question answer period, and then wave your hand or use the icon. We're also going to have a couple of breakout rooms, so there'll be plenty of time to make your voice heard then. So without further ado, here is Adele.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. I agree with Karen. If you're here today,
Right
we
there.
appreciate it. We know how pretty it is outside, and you could be
Why can't I get this?
many other things. Okay. Can you hear me? I'm having trouble with my sound.
We can hear you fine.
Okay,
And Karen, are you going to mute? That'll help for background.
I have, right.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks. Well, I can't think of a more appropriate day for us to be discussing this book, since it's the first day of spring, the vernal equinox. And it also is a holiday it's the Persian New Year of Nowruz, which some of you may be familiar with. They celebrate that all over that part of the world close to Iran. And it goes back, I was reading about it, goes back to 3,000 years celebrating this. And Nowruz means new day. So I like the fact that their New Year's falls on the first day of what I consider the new year, rebirth. And just a personal note, if y'all don't mind me throwing this in, my mother was buried 20 years ago today. And so it always meant something to me back then when that happened, that we were having the funeral on the day that I thought best symbolized rebirth. So that was made it kind of a special day. So we're going to get into talking about the second half of this book. If you were here the first half, that's great. If not, I think you'll be able to follow along whether you've read the book or not, and maybe you'll get interested and want to read the book. But before we start, I wanted to tell you about the upcoming events. So we are looking forward to next month having Laura Heileman, who some of you remember. She used to be here in Nashville and led dream groups and was on our board. And she's going to lead us in a discussion called What Are You Dreaming? So it's just going to be a chance for us all to come together and maybe share dreams and see, with all the chaos in the world right now, if people are having similar types of dreams. Sometimes you can kind of find some common themes. So that should be an interesting thing on Sunday, April 24th. And then on May 15th, Sunday afternoon, this will be really interesting to Nashville musician community, I hope. Dr. Mark Winborn, who is in Memphis, he's a Jungian analyst, also a former musician playing on Beale Street, and was the head of the training program for Jung psychology in Memphis. But he has a book called Deep Blues, where he examines the blues music and blues musicians from an archetypal perspective. And he said he'll be playing clips of songs and some videos, and I think it ought to be really interesting. So that's May 15th. So, okay, and then one little housekeeping note, like Karen said, we're going to maybe do a breakout rooms a couple of times so you can have chance to talk to each other about some of these ideas. And if you can, when you're in the breakout room, if you can turn your video camera on, it really helps with the conversation. So no pressure to talk if you don't want to. But okay, so Michael, would you pull up the slides?
Yes, here we go. And are you able to see the slides now?
I can, I certainly can. I hope other people can.
Yes.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. So this is Earth Has a Soul, C.G. Jung on Nature, Technology, and Modern Life, book discussion part 2. Thank you, Karen, for last month's discussion of chapters 1 through 4 of this incredible book. And I must say, I now realize it's a daunting task to try to summarize even a second half of this book and to cover it in 1 hour. And I think that's probably because this is a book that's been edited together from Jung's writings, personal letters, interviews, speeches, and the editor, Meredith Sabini, did a terrific job of pulling all these excerpts together. But therefore, she's cut out the fluff, and almost every paragraph has an interesting idea or quote that we could spend 10 minutes talking about. Okay, next slide, Michael. So I liked this quote: "The knowledge of the heart is in no book and is not to be found in the mouth of any teacher, but grows out of you like the green seed from the dark earth." This is sort of showing Jung on his poetic side. You know, he could do very academic, scientific writing, and then at times he's very poetic. In this book, you get to see a more intimate, personal side, especially from letters. And it shows a more, like I say, intimate, poetic side than his academic writings do. The book also is a real personal testament to how Jung lived his life. He didn't just come up with these academic ideas. They weren't just an intellectual practice. This is how he lived, and I think he then came up with a lot of theories based on how he was already living his life. Karen pointed this out last month, but I want to say again, remember that he was a man of his time. He was writing from the early 1900s up until his death in 1961. So some of the language he uses seems antiquated and possibly even a little offensive to our modern ears. He speaks of modern man, and which we would now maybe refer to as humankind instead of mankind. He also refers to indigenous people as primitives, by which he meant the kind of primal people of earlier times and some of the people, indigenous cultures he visited in Africa and New Mexico. Anyway, that's just, keep that in mind that he was writing a long time ago. Okay, next slide. So some of the overall themes, just to kind of go back over these or to keep these in mind as we explore these final 4 chapters. The main theme, I guess we would say, modern humans' loss of connection to nature and to our instincts. This was a concern of Jung's. A second theme that comes through loud and clear is Jung's distrust of modernity. He was a very kind of old-fashioned man, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Third, this is a quote from Jung: "Nature is not matter only, she is also spirit." So examining how nature has been sort of despiritualized in our day, and how that occurred. Fourth, consciousness seen as both a blessing and a curse. Jung had strong opinions on some of these things. So one thing I want us to discuss later is how you agree or disagree with some of his strong opinions. But he said that consciousness was the means by which our primal unity with nature was disrupted. And then at the end, the last chapter, 8, suggested remedies to the loss of contact with nature, which will leave us on a more hopeful note, I hope. Okay, next slide. So the editor, Meredith Sabini, decided to organize this book by imagining that she was posing questions to Jung. How did our loss of connection to nature come about? What are the consequences of this loss? Have we really conquered nature? And how might this rupture be healed? And I wanted to point out this photo that I've included here. This is Jung camping on an island in Lake Zurich. This is about 1920. I kind of love this photo with him and his bare feet on the earth. He just really looks like he's in his element. Now, the chapters we're going to discuss today will be partly answering these questions. So chapter 5 answers the question that we haven't really conquered nature, and that's his opinion. Chapter 6 talks about the consequences of modern life and technology. And chapter 7 talks about humans being what Jung considered the greatest danger to the planet, human beings. And then chapter 8, he brings it back around to ideas on how this rupture between modern people and nature might be healed. Okay, next slide. Okay, so starting here with chapter 5, the title that the editor has given it is "We Have Conquered Nature" is a mere slogan. So that right there tells you basically Jung's view on answering that question of whether or not we've conquered nature. As I said, Jung had a deep concern over the way humans have attempted to conquer nature. I thought this photo showed the kind of the battle going on between nature and man-made buildings. In this chapter, he traces the history of the rise of Christianity and then science, and how these both led to the gradual suppression of nature spirits, along with elevating a rational mindset in the material world of science. And he said that this created a split into faith and reason that had not been there before in earlier times. I'm going to read you a quote from page 123. Remember, he is using his language. We said it's a little dated. Primitive man, being closer to his instincts, like the animal, is characterized by fear of novelty and adherence to tradition. To our way of thinking, he's painfully backward, whereas we exalt progress. But our progressiveness, though it may result in a great many delighted wish fulfillments, piles up an equally gigantic Promethean debt, which has to be paid off from time to time in the form of hideous catastrophes. So, goodness, that's a little bit pessimistic. Next slide, please. I saw a lot of chapter 5 as a sort of a cautionary tale. The concern, he says here, domination of nature through technology and science has created new problems. He talks a lot about overpopulation, and this was a major concern more back in the 60s and 70s when I was in college studying sociology. We were talking a lot about, by this time in history, our time today, we would be in even worse shape than we are based on overpopulation. Not so much back then, attention to environmental problems. So Jung sort of anticipated those, but he talked more about overpopulation. He thought that nature might exact revenge and solve these problems for us through catastrophes, such as natural disasters, nuclear destruction, starvation, etc. And some think today, that the pandemic, people have speculated the pandemic could be partly nature's solution to overpopulation. So again, this is all fairly negative, difficult stuff. Okay, next slide. Another theme or concept he stresses is that humankind's new tool, consciousness and the conscious mind, that it's a recent consciousness as a recent development in the last, I think he said possibly, say, 4,000 years, and that humans are not very mature in their use of it yet. He said it would be a delusion to imagine we've attained anything like a high level of consciousness. And he talked about how we had a belief through our new consciousness that we weren't quite sure how to use it correctly at times, had come to rely a lot on our own will and willpower. And here on page 126, this quote, "Our technical skill has grown to be so dangerous that the most urgent question is how the man entrusted with the control of this skill should be constituted. It is infinitely more important to strip him of the illusion of his power." So I couldn't resist including those photos. I think so much of what he was writing, and some of this he was writing in the 30s, a lot of it came right after World War II, but it's certainly relevant in another way today. He as far as the thing about free will, he said we believe exclusively in consciousness and free will, and we're not so aware that these powers control us. Okay, next slide, Michael. Another interesting segment in this chapter, Jung's talking about the nature's loss of the spiritual dimension, how first Christianity and then scientific materialism destroyed a belief in nature spirits. Nymphs, these are some examples. That's a water nymph on the left. A nymph was in Greek mythology a female divinity, usually associated with fertile growing things or water. Incubi and succubi that you see on an incubus and a succubus on the right. I think the succubus is the female, the male is an incubus. They were shape-shifting fiends who delighted in the corruption of mortals through temptation. Werewolves, fairies, all sorts of nature spirits that were accepted at that certain time. Next slide. So, where did these spirits go? Jung stressed that this energy didn't just go away. It was archetypal energies creating the beliefs in these spirits, and they had to go somewhere. So I've got several quotes here. "The fantastic mythological world of the Middle Ages has simply changed its place. Man himself has taken over their role without knowing it." In other words, these psychic energies that were once projected outward onto nature spirits have taken up residence in the human unconscious. Another quote, "The demonism of nature, which man had apparently triumphed over, he has unwittingly swallowed into himself. He overlooked the fact that they were at bottom the products of certain factors in the human psyche." And then one more. "After it became impossible for the demons to inhabit the rocks, woods, mountains, and rivers, they used human beings as much more dangerous dwelling places." Jung said here and in other places that he thought the gods became neuroses at times, phobias, obsessions, that these psychic energies that had produced the gods of the old world could not vanish. They just took up new forms. Okay, next slide. So this next chapter, 6, is called "Our Civilizing Potential Has Led Us Down the Wrong Path." So again, the chapter title that I guess the editor chose, the chapter titles, makes very clear Jung's position. He was profoundly distrustful of modern life and, as I said earlier, old-fashioned. In this chapter, Jung explores the impact of technology and, quote, progress on the human psyche. And he talks about how the pace of the development of consciousness happened so fast that it left the unconscious far behind. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. He also talks about just the pace and tempo of modern life being too fast. And there's an interesting story, in fact, on page 140 about a man in Africa. I don't know if he actually, someone told him this or he experienced this. He said there's a story of a native African who'd been invited to be driven in a car for the first time. After half an hour, he asked the people to stop the car. He stepped out and stretched himself on the ground. They asked him whether he was sick, and he said no, he felt all right. but he just had to wait for his soul that had remained behind. They went too fast for it. I have to think of my American visitors who fly over here in 6 hours and are still in America for several days without noticing it. I don't know if any of you have ever had that thought. I have had that feeling before when I flew back from Europe or from Europe to America, that my body traveled through time a lot quicker, and my mind and my thoughts were still where I'd just been. Okay, next slide. In this chapter, Jung expresses a lot of concern for America. He said, in conquering American wilderness, we had, quote, sacrificed many beautiful things. And he contrasts it with Europe. I'm going to tell you, I'm reading a fair number of quotes from the book because, frankly, I can't say this any better than Jung said it himself. So I just figured this was the best way.
Mhm.
Here on page 142, he said, there's no question, he's talking to Americans, but that you have sacrificed many beautiful things to achieve your great cities and the domination of your wildernesses. To build so great a mechanism, you must have smothered many growing things. Whatever a man builds is likely to destroy him, and the builder in America is in danger of being destroyed. That's pretty strong language. He goes on to say he thought this tendency of Americans to destroy everything which hinders your progress grows out of your Puritan ancestry. That's kind of interesting. We could go down that road, but we're not going to right now. And then another quote on the next page, he says, America does not see that it's in any danger. It's facing its most tragic moment. And since it does not know this, I would not want to hurt it. And then he says, you are absolutely divorced from nature in a way, and that accounts for the drug abuse. This was him talking in 1950. So you can only imagine what he might say now. And then he had some pretty strong language, and this is something I'd like for us to discuss our own thoughts on this, about New York City and living in big cities. He said American life was uprooted and divorced from nature, especially in New York City. And listen to what he says on page 143 about New York. The enormous machines and factories, the steamers, the trains, the automobiles, all that has become so overwhelming that man is the mere victim of it all. Look at the city of New York. Nobody can tell me that a man feels like a king in New York. He is just an ant on an ant heap. It doesn't count at all. He is superfluous there. So I say, wow, that's almost fighting words. The next page, he says, a big city is like a holocaust of humanity, as Zola expressed it. Okay, just hang on to your thoughts about that. Like I say, maybe we can discuss that in just a minute. Okay. Oops. All right, next slide, Michael. And a few more concepts or themes that there's so much in this, even this one chapter. Civilization is a most expensive process, and its acquisitions have been paid for by enormous losses, the extent of which we have largely forgotten or never appreciated. I might want for us to think about what are these losses. Much better to know that life on this earth is balanced between an equal amount of pleasure and misery, and real progress is only the psychological adaptation to the various forms of individual misery. So he was writing this toward the end of his life. I think the first quote in 1961 is when he died at age 86. He sounds profoundly pessimistic about modern life in general. And then the second quote he's writing fairly soon after World War II in 1948. And he goes on to say that more modern humans try to alleviate, quote, he calls misery with new gadgets and technology to make life better, the more unintended consequences in the form of what he called new miseries like divorces, neuroses, drug use. He said he preferred, quote, a modest poverty or tangible discomfort like no bathroom or electricity to, quote, those pests. Okay. Next slide, please. And he goes into more detail about this idea of consciousness as a new phenomenon. In Western Europe, polytheistic beliefs were forced underground, he said, by adoption of Christianity. I'm going to read a little bit from page 145. Our natural evolution in Western Europe was broken by the introduction of a psychology and spirituality that had developed from a civilization higher than our own. He does not say what that is. We were interrupted at the very beginning when our beliefs in Western Europe were still barbarously polytheistic, and those beliefs were forced underground and have remained there for the last 2,000 years. That, I believe, explains the divisiveness that is found in Western mind. Still in a primitive state, we were forced to adopt the comparatively sophisticated doctrines of Christian grace and love. A disassociation was thus produced in the Western man between the conscious and unconscious parts of his mentality. Western man became someone divided between his conscious and unconscious personality. So that's an interesting theory that Christianity and some of the beliefs were kind of foisted on the Western Europeans maybe when they weren't quite ready. It's the way I understand what he's saying, and we have not caught up with that yet. He does offer a solution, and we'll talk about that more later. He says, a halt to this split between our higher and lower selves. We must unite conscious man with primitive man. Next slide. There's an interesting section where he discusses machines as the dragons of today. He said, dragon myths are the last vestiges of ancestral memories of the saurians. The saurians were the dinosaurs. I love the photo of this fire-spitting dragon and the plane firebombing, which unfortunately might be all too relevant for us today, considering what's happened the last few weeks in Ukraine. Dragons in our day are great machines, cars, big guns. These are the archetypes now. Suppose an age when the machine gets on top of us, then it would become a dragon. We are investing the machine with creative power. It can overgrow us in an visible way. This made me wonder what Jung might say about the development of artificial intelligence. You know, so much of what he was writing seems almost quaint compared to the technology we have now. Next slide, please. He expresses some pretty strong opinions about what type of society or culture he figures is best for people. I'm fully committed to the idea that human existence should be rooted in the earth. He talks about the rewards of the tangible rewards of farming, like the man holding what he's grown, growing one's own food, compared to the abstract nature of work in the industrial age. He talks about how a worker in a factory, it's very abstract. He might not even see the finished product. He's just working on one small piece, so he's not getting much psychological reward for his work, the way people do who can work the earth. Or he said even people who were in the time, one person crafts where they would see the finished product. I wonder what Jung would think about how abstract life has gotten in terms of being cut off from tangible rewards now that we work on computers so much at the time. Okay, and then one last thing I wanted to include from this chapter, he had very strong opinions about noise. He said, I personally detest noise and flee it whenever and wherever possible. He was really, he might come across as a little bit of a grumpy old man. That's one thing I want us to think about. But he said that we had an unconscious desire for noise, that, quote, we wouldn't have noise if we didn't secretly want it. That fear loves noise because it stops the fear from being heard. He said, though, that he detested noise because it not only disturbed his concentration, but it required additional psychic energy just to try to ignore it. This was in a letter. So some of these things, he might not have written about in his academic writings. He said that noise, quote, protects us from painful reflection. And he talked about children doing homework with the distraction of a radio back in his day. And again, put the girl in the picture here with the headphones. This is a big subject right now about children, school children, and the distractions of technology. So I thought this would be a good time to take a break. And Karen, you can decide. Michael, can you shut down the slides for a minute? But I thought we could discuss the paradox of the advantages and disadvantages of technology today. What do you think about the future and artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, etc.? Do you think that Jung was a grumpy, kind of provincial old man, or was he enlightened on these subjects? And do you agree or disagree that progress has taken our civilization down the wrong path? So lots of things you could talk about. Maybe how you feel about noise and distraction, and how do you deal with those?
Okay, are you ready? And we're going to take about 12 minutes. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, here we go.
We're all coming back.
Yep. And Michael, we didn't see that last slide on noise. That didn't show up.
Let me see. Oh, you know what? She had told me to turn back from that. So here it is. I can share it right now when you're ready. But she had told me I advanced too quickly, so I went back to it.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, that's up to,
Should I share that now or wait till Adele comes back?
I want to wait till Adele comes back.
Okay. So now are we all back, Karen, or people coming back?
It looks like it. Yeah. And somebody had tried to make a comment just as we were going into the breakout session. So I wanted to give them an opportunity, and I don't know who it was, if they're still here.
It was me, and yeah,
it was in our small group.
It was me. I went into a breakout group, and they all talked, and we all talked about it. It was great. Thank you very much.
Okay. And Adele, if you could speak up just a little bit more.
Okay. Is that better? I'll turn my volume up a little bit more.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And at the end, maybe we'll have some extra time and we can just talk as one large group, and you can share what came up in some of your smaller groups. So, okay. Well, let's get back to the slides. And
Adele, Karen pointed out that I had returned. I'm going to share it now, but I'll be on the side where Jung on noise. So that's
okay.
where I had turned backward from it. And can you see that slide now?
Yep, yep.
Okay. So am I ready? Are you ready for me to move forward?
Yes, we can advance to the next one. So
Okay, hang on here.
Say chapter 7.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So the title, like I say, each of the titles of these chapters tell us something that I guess the editor wanted to stress. We know nothing of man, and that comes from a quote from Jung. It's again a sort of prophetic chapter and a warning. And not, a lot of you heard this quote. It's in the photo here. The world today hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the human psyche. The first time I ever heard that, I thought, well, what exactly does that mean? We have to think about it, but I hope it'll become a little more clear as we're talking about this chapter. Jung said that humans, not nature, are the great danger to the world. Quote, we are the danger. The psyche is the danger. And then he said, with all the scientific and technical achievements, we have yet to learn much about the human psyche. And we know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied because we are the organ of all evil. Jung talks about how psychology, especially in some of his writings, when he was writing some of this in around 1930, that psychology was a very new science. And so very few people knew much at all about psychology and about the individual man. He also was writing, as I've got on the bottom of the slide here, some of this was from a 1950 interview. So this was only, 4 years after World War II had ended. And he feared the atom bomb in the hands of someone with a disturbed psyche. So just something, of course, I think are all fearing today. Next slide, please. So I think that explains a lot why Jung talked about his fear of mass movements, which he said rendered reason powerless, because reason appeals to the conscious mind only, and the masses react to unconscious effects. I think the cartoon is kind of self-explanatory. It's a herd thing. And then on page 165, he's talking about how he says we can't protect ourselves by arming ourselves to the teeth. Nowadays, the world is, well, let's see. Reason has proven it completely powerless precisely because its arguments have an effect only on the conscious mind and not on the unconscious, talking about the danger of a mass movement. The greatest danger of all comes from the masses in whom the effects of the unconscious pile up cumulatively, and the reasonableness of the conscious mind is stifled. Every mass organization is a latent danger, just as much as a heap of dynamite. And not to get too political, but I couldn't help but think about what happened in our country on January 6th.
Yeah.
And possibly, we could think about what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and all of these are supported by some kind of mass movement of people, and the people who are manipulating the masses are using propaganda techniques, and as it says, as Jung said, it's not appealing to their rational reasoning, it's appealing to them on an emotional unconscious level. Okay, next slide, please. So Jung's solution to this, he stressed the importance of the individual. So here are 3 quotes. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will undergo it and carry it through. The change must begin with one individual. It might be any one of us. We look around for collective measures. There is only one remedy: to emphasize and increase the value of the individual. And it is a false view that the individual is nothing. The individual is the vessel of life. Now, all 3 of these quotes came from something called Jung Speaks that was based on interviews in 1950. So again, he's writing and talking about a few years after World War II, and was very skeptical of mass movements, both fascist and communist, where the individual person was not viewed as unimportant compared to the mass. Okay, next slide. I thought he had some interesting things to say about animals. He said animals are more obedient to divine and natural laws than humans are. He said that animals can only obey the laws of nature. They don't have the conscious mind to develop their own willpower. He said, in nature, the animal is a well-behaved citizen and does nothing extravagant. Only man is extravagant. Animals have no power of their own, but man has wrested away a certain amount of energy from nature and made of it his own willpower. In other words, to shape the world to meet our needs. Looking into the eyes of an animal, he talked about, as a way to connect with the animal spirit within our own animal nature, which he said was part of the collective unconscious. And I love the picture of the cat with the eyes. I don't know how many of you might have had this experience. If you have a pet and you've stared into each other's eyes, it can be an almost sort of transcendental experience. This quote was from someone, A.B. Williams. When I look into the eyes of an animal, I do not see an animal. I see a living being. I see a friend. I feel a soul. So Jung was talking about connecting at this soulful level of the collective unconscious. And he also talked about us respecting the fact that we're animals and our own animal nature. Next slide, please.
Linda, Adele, may I make a quick comment there?
Sure.
Yeah, Neha in our group had this question of where is the soul of man, soul of the planet, soul of Earth? Why is our presentation called the soul of Earth? And so that was something we tried to figure out. But it's interesting here that looking into an animal's eyes, I feel a soul.
Mhm. For my own personal answer, I guess I sort of quote feel the soul of the planet sometimes when I'm out in nature, just looking at flowers, or like you say, looking in the eyes of an animal. What did other people in your group say?
Well, maybe we can come back to that. Why not?
Okay. All right. So in this piece called The Meaning of Psychology for Modern Man, this was an essay that was based on a lecture Jung gave in 1931, and it contains some of his most poetic thoughts. And he's talking about psychology, again, being a very new science at this time. And he said, therefore, it's not understood by many people. Human consciousness is also young and fragile, saying our present day consciousness is a mere child. And so he said, because consciousness was like a new toy, when you consider the history of the whole planet, just in the last thousands of years, that people are still astonished to realize that another person is really different from themselves. He said, before we had this individual consciousness, people did not see themselves as separate from the group so much. And so people were alike. Jung compared our ego to a small ship floating on a sea of the collective unconscious, which just to give you an idea of how vast this unknown part, unconscious part is. He said that the idea that we should all be one way or think alike is a relic from this, what he called the primordial night of consciousness, when everyone thought and acted in the same way. Next slide. So toward the end of this chapter, he did offer a few hopeful comments. This is supposed to be this photo of a seed taken from underground as it's growing, about to poke up through the earth. So some nice quotes, I thought, that were offered some hopeful message. It says, civilization does not decay, it regenerates. The germ of the coming era has even now been born in the darkness, which is what the seed to me would represent. I think he even says that it's been planted in the dark. Even if the whole world were to fall to pieces, the unity of the psyche would never be shattered. And I'm going to get us, when we do our breakout room, to discuss a little bit about this sentence. He says, this idea that the germ of the coming era has even now been born in the darkness, and how we might agree or disagree with that. He also, in this chapter, goes into some emphasis on the importance of dreams, which most anyone who's familiar with Jung knows that dream work is an important part of Jungian psychology. But there's some wonderful explanations and quotes. This is a kind of famous quote. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. He said, dreams are impartial, spontaneous products of the unconscious psyche. They are pure nature. They show us the unvarnished natural truth. And he said, if we wish to investigate our own nature, dreams are the most suitable media for this purpose. So I feel like here he's trying to make it clear why he considered dreams so important. That first quote, where it says they're a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, goes on to say, opening into that cosmic night, which was psyche, long before there was any ego consciousness. So I thought this would be a good time to break into some breakout discussions again with the groups, and take a few minutes to discuss a couple of things. One, I'd like to think about your thoughts on whether we are in transition to a new era, that the seed has been planted, even in this, what at times seems like dark times that we're in. Jung, in his book Eon, predicted that we were transitioning from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, and that would be occurring around this time. So I'd like to think about it and see, are we, sometimes people say it is darkest before the dawn, or that we're going through the labor pains of birthing a new era. This would be a whole different discussion, but in his book Aeon, he talks about this age of Pisces being around 2,200 years, and then we're moving into this age of Aquarius. So these are thousands of years epochs, and they're very hopeful that we're going to come back to some type of wholeness more in the age of Aquarius. But I want to just say, see if y'all have thoughts on, are there signs of some type of transition or evolution in consciousness? I feel like we see some, that there's more and more emphasis on getting back to nature, with a lot of young people becoming farmers. We've got farmers markets, farm to table restaurants, things like that were not popular when I was younger. Do you think things have changed much since Jung's time, that we're making some progress in our knowledge and understanding of psychology? So those are some things to talk about. And then if you get through with that and want to talk about dreams, I want to let you talk about what you think about dreams being hidden doorways to your soul, or what are some other ways some of you might think you make contact with your unconscious self or your soul. So Karen, if you can divide us up again.
Hi, Judy.
So Karen, are you going to break us up into breakout rooms?
You're muted, Karen. Karen, you're muted.
Here we go.
Waiting just a minute till everybody's back in the main room again. Okay, thanks. Is that it, Karen?
Oh, and I found the quote. Somebody had asked, where does that come from? The earth has a soul. Mm-hmm. And I talked about it in part one, but the actual quote from this book is that every country or people has its own angel, just as the earth has a soul.
Yeah. What page was that on? Do you know?
I found it online. I don't think I found it in where the original citation. Okay. So let's see. I don't know if it says.
Well, that's.
Would you repeat that, please, Karen?
Every country or people has its own angel, just as the earth has a soul.
That's a good lead in to a question that somebody brought up in our group, and some other groups were discussing. Gail, maybe you can say this, you said it, or whoever brought it up originally. How do we know, or how do you sense the soul of the earth? How do you know the earth has a soul? Is that right? Am I saying that the way you asked?
I would add to that, it's a delusion we suffer, that we think that mankind is the highest consciousness on the planet, when it may be the very planet that we are part of has its own consciousness. And how do we connect with that, or do we feel connected to that?
Susie Holloway, who was in our group. Susie, would you share what you told us about your experience in Africa?
Yes, let me unmute. I guess I'm okay. My son, who I said is a very soulful person himself and is a photographer, was in Africa. And he came home and said he was lying on the earth in Africa, and he could feel and hear the heartbeat of the earth.
Gave us chill bumps to think about that. I said maybe you have to be somewhere as remote and as far away from man-made civilization or something to be able to listen on that deep level.
Linda, may I add to, Adele, may I add to that? Because we have the slide on noise. And you may recall on our first session, I described the report of the anthropologist Hilda Cooper and her daughter Jenny Cooper on making a film in Africa in 1967 in Swaziland of a situation of initiation of young women. And the point that Hilda brought out is that in Swaziland, it's more quiet than a refrigerator in our rooms. So if we talk about noise and its impact, the report from Hilda from Swaziland is that nature at that point is very quiet.
Yes, I'd like to add briefly to that. It's my understanding. I mean, in fact, I've tried it too. It's very difficult because there is, even when we think it's quiet, it's really not quiet here in our current environment. But apparently, when it gets very, very quiet, you can actually make out what is referred to as the sound of silence. It's a very, very high, very, very, it's a certain hum there, but you can become aware of it, and it's not the blood rushing through your ears. There is a sound of silence, but you have to be in a very, very quiet place to experience that.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think another metaphor is when you think about light pollution, if you've been to a place, like once I was out in the high desert in California and there were no lights, and you can see the stars in a way that is not normally possible. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very moving.
Mm-hmm.
For those that don't know, in Tennessee, we have Pickett State Park is the only park in the Southeast that is registered with the Dark Sky Association. So it's a beautiful little park, and you can see the Milky Way, all of that. It's a dark park. So that, it's a little bit closer than the West, but I agree with you, Linda. I've seen it and it's incredible. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, that's interesting. I was going to say, I don't know about the rest of you, but I used to wake up earlier, and when the days started getting longer, if I could be outside by 5:30 or so on my porch in the morning, it seemed like the man-made world was still asleep and the animals kind of were still in charge, just with the birds and all. So I always kind of felt like I was just kind of visiting that other world, and it before everybody else woke up. But some of you have other ways that you like to, obvious ways of gardening and taking walks in nature, but anybody want to comment on how they try to make that connection?
Well, I want to say one other thing. When the pandemic started and we were all quarantined, you could go for a walk and it was quiet. There was no traffic. People were on foot to get outside. And it was so peaceful. And I loved being even in my backyard because the birds and the nature was more out there because they felt safe to be out there because it was so quiet. And that was such a gift, such a treat. That when people talked about the hardship of the quarantine, but that was a blessing of the quarantine.
That thing came up in our group, and I've had the experience, to add to what Linda said, for the first time walking in my neighborhood over these past few years and establishing deep friendships with people that I walk with as neighbors. And this thread started for us in our group with Neha, wondering, again, I mentioned it before, where's the soul of the earth? What is that? And she's pointing out, what does it mean in a city like New York? And our discussion included that New York, San Francisco, and other big cities have actually parks that were very specifically designed by people who well knew how to integrate nature. And the issue is that in the adversity of the noise, the headwinds of the noise we've just talked about from Gerd there, is against that headwind, for instance, in New York, It's been the movement in the last few years that has taken over the unused rail lines to turn them into nature walks. So what that means is that there's still, it's the, Linda, or Adele, it's the dark seed coming up. The dark seed coming up is, we can turn this into a greenway. We can turn this back to nature. So that to me is a really essential illustration that we do move through and we do have an impact.
I recall the first time when I had moved to Tennessee and the first time I drove down the Natchez Trace Parkway, that the absence of advertisements and just these, I mean, just having plain nature there had a physical effect on me. It's almost like I dropped like 10, levels of blood pressure. It was unbelievable. Just the absence of these screaming signs everywhere, somebody trying to sell you something, was very profound. I recall that distinctly.
I felt that way on the Natchez Trace too. I feel like we're really lucky to have that. And what is it that is it in the Japanese culture where they do forest bathing? Is that what it's called? It does seem like to me, maybe I'm an optimist, but there is a lot going on in our culture right now, bringing emphasis back on ways to be connected to nature. Whether it's people wanting food that's grown locally or growing their own food, or just, lots of small ways that I see hopeful signs. Well, we have just a couple more slides and then I want to do some more talk. So Michael, can we go back to?
Coming up.
Okay.
Here's where hang on, let me share this now.
Last chapter, because this is the most, so be the next one.
Yep.
Okay. Chapter 8. This is a Jung quote: nature must not win, but cannot lose. So I want us to think about what that means. Maybe we can talk about that in a minute. And I realized I used this same picture twice. I must have liked it a lot. This is at the beginning of the book, but I just like seeing Jung out there doing this. I mean, this isn't the way, compare this to the pictures that we've seen through the years of him in his study, writing and being so serious. And this really does, I think, show Jung. He really walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk. He lived this way. So in this chapter, he says, our evolutionary task is not to return to nature regressively, but to bring into balance the consciousness we have attained with the primordial foundation on which our consciousness rests. In other words, to achieve a balance between the life we live and the one we have forgotten. And to me, this is a good illustration of Jung's theory that he wrote about so often, about holding the tension of the opposites. That we need to find a way to hold a balance between our animal and our spiritual natures, between our conscious and unconscious minds, between the past and our present, various ways. And it's a paradox. But he talked a lot about this tension of the opposites. Okay, next slide, please. In this last chapter, he included this interesting story. What was really interesting to me is that it said that Jung loved this story. I don't know if you got this far in the book, if everyone was able to read this, but I'm just going to read this to you quickly. It said that Jung loved to tell this story, and he had heard it directly from Richard Wilhelm, who he worked with on, Wilhelm was in China and did a translation of the I Ching, and their relationship helped Jung get very interested in Eastern thought and Eastern religions. But they said that Jung would tell this story whenever he had a chance. So I'm just going to read it to you quickly. This is supposedly actually Richard Wilhelm, this happened. I think it's also kind of a fairy tale in their culture, so I don't know if the truth is somewhere in between. There was a great drought where Wilhelm lived. For months, there had not been a drop of rain, and the situation became catastrophic. The Catholics made processions, the Protestants made prayers, and the Chinese burned joss sticks and shot off guns to frighten away the demons of the drought. but with no result. Finally, the Chinese said, "We will fetch the rainmaker." And from another province, a dried-up old man appeared. The only thing he asked for was a quiet little house somewhere, and there he locked himself in for 3 days. On the 4th day, clouds gathered, and there was a great snowstorm at that time of the year when no snow was expected, an unusual amount. And the town was so full of rumors about the wonderful rainmaker that Wilhelm went to ask the man how he did it. In true European fashion, he said, "They call you the rainmaker. Will you tell me how you made the snow?" And the little Chinaman said, "I did not make the snow. I'm not responsible." Wilhelm said, "But what have you done these last 3 days?" "Oh, I can explain that. I come from another country where things are in order. Here they are out of order. They are not as they should be by the ordinance of heaven. Therefore, the whole country is not in Tao. And I also am not in the natural order of things because I'm in a disordered country. So I had to wait 3 days until I was back in Tao. And then naturally, the rain came." Jung says this is the way the East thinks without causality. He simply got back in the Tao. This is an idea of what I call synchronicity. We think according to the Western assumption of causality that one thing brings another thing, but that in itself is a magic idea. So this idea that if you put things right inside, they will come out right outside automatically. That's a, again, this is something we could spend a whole session talking about. But he said that it sounds like he liked to tell this at dinner parties or whenever he got the chance. So on the last slide, Michael, or next to last slide, recommendations for healing. So in this chapter, Jung recommended, quote, touching nature from the outside and touching nature from the inside. Again, he said we don't want to go back in time in a regressive way. We want to just bring what we have now with our consciousness, but then balance it with more being in touch with our natural selves. So to touch nature from the outside, he suggested getting closer to nature by take a walk in the woods or a bath in the sea, owning land if possible, and working the land, gardening or farming, living in small communities, not cities, working less and simplifying our lifestyles. To touch nature from the inside, he suggests engaging in reflection and quiet solitude, reconnecting with our past, avoiding distractions, which he called newspapers, television, radio, and gramophones. So, see, that's a little dated. We could add to the list our cell phones and computers. And, of course, paying serious attention to our dreams. Now, it's interesting, really, if you think about it, Jung is basically recommending how he lived. He lived on the lakefront. He was able to have his home on the lake, and then he had his retreat at Bollingen that's also on the lake. So, but what about people who cannot afford land? And, was he being elitist or idealistic here? But, there are other ways. Somebody mentioned just a minute ago about having parks. I mean, there've got to be ways to build into our culture for people who can't all own their own land. So this, he was from another time. We have to take what he said and think how we could apply it today. Okay.
May I say something?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I just, Dr. Oldman in our small group said something which is kind of staying with me quite a bit, and I think clarifying some of these points here, which was, as I heard it, it's really the bottom line almost is to come into and to develop and to realize this relationship with the soul within ourselves, like my own soul, and for each of us to realize that that soul part of myself, and not to kind of and not to get caught up in some of these other larger constructs which feel a little bit daunting to me, at least. But that could be just, a matter of my personality and my psyche. And I also wanted to, almost a corollary to that is, for me, is that, these recommendations, wonderful as they are kind of one person's, that is C.G. Jung's experience, and don't need to be, I just feel like, I feel like I feel this can come across as a little bit of a pressure, like do this, this, and this, and then you will come in contact with, and then you'll live a more, connected and balanced life. And that may have been true for him. I don't know if he's universally, I don't think he can universally recommend it. Which is not to say that they're, that they're not useful or valuable. But for me, I think what I'm taking away is the central relationship with my soul, irrespective of whether I live in a city or out, in the country. If there isn't that relationship with my soul, I've kind of missed the point.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Mike, we have one last slide here, just to sort of wrap it up. I love this quote, and I also love this photo, which is the one from the front of the book, because I get the feeling that Jung maybe was his happiest when he was there at the water and at the lake. But he said, "Nature, psyche, and life appear to me like divinity unfolded. What more could I ask for?" That was a beautiful quote. But so sort of in conclusion, what I want to say, and then maybe we have some time, we can hear other people's thoughts. This collection of Jung's thoughts, to me, affirms that he didn't just create these theories on this intellectual level. Like I said, he developed concepts based on his own life and how he lived his life. And he was living at a different time, so we can only take these recommendations and apply them in our life today, as is possible in today's world. And certainly all of us can't own our land and farm, or maybe don't have the option to live in small towns other than cities, or even want to. But I would say Jung, to me, offers and continues to offer inspiration as to how we might live our life more in balance between the man-made and natural world, so that we can all do our part to create a better world by first working on ourselves, because that was the point he was always getting back to, that each person had to do their own work. But thank you for listening, and then that's all I have with the slides. We have time now to have some more discussion. I'd love to just hear other people's comments on what you talked about in your small groups, or other questions, or how did you like the book? Did you, like I say, did you find any of this a little over the top, that he was so opinionated? And you can just, we're a small enough group now, you can just unmute yourself and raise your hand if you want to talk.
Adele, if nobody's going to step forward, let's wait a minute. But I have a thought to, but I'll be quiet.
Well, go ahead, Michael. We have plenty of time.
Well, in our group, and you left us with the discussion that we're changing an age from Pisces to Aquarius. So, luckily in my group, Linda was the one who could help describe that and understand that a little bit. And a thread came out that Linda was talking about, where there was more of a brotherly sense in a society. So that left me thinking, and I've mentioned this book before. It's called The Upswing, and it's by quite an important a professor from Harvard. And the point is, it's called The Upswing. And the reason I'm bringing it up at the moment is quite concise. It's that the beginning chapter of the book describes a situation that you would say, wow, you've done a really good job of describing all the pressures, all the noise, all the disruption, all the things that are so difficult, the enormous wealth, the inequality of wealth, not to mention what's happening in Ukraine right now. But when you finish the last page of that chapter, it says, this was 1920. So the point is, this is called the upswing, because 1920 was the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, enormous centralized wealth. And the reaction to it was a movement toward more brotherliness, toward more responsibility, that it put a stop to that trend. So in that sense, I see Gerd smiling there. It's a kind of a hopeful thing, especially with what we have right now in Ukraine, that conditions now reflect conditions that were present in our nation 100 years ago, and there is potential, and we've dotted the little pieces that we see happening. So it makes me feel, at least, there still is substance to that we all will move forward, and that doesn't lighten the responsibility on each of us. Stephanie, you're muted.
Two things come to mind, and that's the we're going through this period that I think I heard someone say that it's like plagiarism because we're doing it again, and then where does that come from? So Richard Tarnas, a speaker that we've had in this group, or a video that we've watched in this group, says that this is a Uranus and Pluto, the result of the planets. It's a planetary event, and it happens every 40 years or every 60 years. It depends on whether it's squared or, so anyway, this is exactly a repeat of the things that we've seen in our history books. So, and I've lost the thread on what the second thing was. So if anybody else has a comment.
Well, it's interesting to pick up the thread of the Aquarian, the Aquarian myth, the Aquarian age that's coming up. So we're coming from the Piscean age, the age of the sacrificed god, and then the new myth of the Aquarian is more of the Uranus, the Uranus myth, the myth of the revolutionary. And Uranus, Aquarius is also an air sign, so it's a very mental age. In our breakaway group, we were talking about how psychology is really coming into its own. It's one of the most popular majors at universities, and we're seeing this new sort of expansion of non-traditional forms of spirituality. A lot of people are conceptualizing spirituality in terms of psychology. So it's just really fascinating to see where this is all going. But I think Jung's becoming more popular. He like the intersection of psychology and spirituality is becoming more and more prevalent, and perhaps it will really have a flowering in this Aquarian age. Uranus now is said to rule Aquarius, and Uranus can be a metaphor, symbolically is not an entirely easy planet, but very innovative and prone to sudden shifts and shocks, I would say.
Aquarius is co-ruled by Uranus and Saturn, which are so opposite. That tension. That's And I think we're already feeling that's the polarization between the Uranian, the new, the breaking up of the old forms, versus the Saturn that wants to nail everything down and keep everything the same. And there's something else I wanted to respond to that you said. That was a great description that you gave. Uranus also rules technology.
Right.
So, here Jung is saying technology is the enemy of being in touch with nature, we're going to have to figure out how to integrate the technology with the need to save our souls, so to speak.
It's said that that Uranus is actually the higher frequency of Mercury.
Yeah.
So Mercury rules communication and innovation and writing and so Uranus is this just higher vibration of that. So maybe more sophisticated, and maybe our technology will start to. Arthur C. Clarke said that sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic. Perhaps the technology of the future will be indistinguishable from nature, or become so sophisticated that we kind of are able to integrate into nature more, as opposed to technology removing us from it.
Lynn and Florine both had things to say.
I want to speak to that with Alan's last point and connecting it to the statement earlier about balance and the rainmaker. I keep thinking about soil regeneration and the soil microbiology, the microbiome of the earth. If it is in balance, particularly with fungi and bacteria, we do not need fertilizer. We can use just compost. We can use compost tea from that very soil to ward off pests. It takes care of itself. And I think technology has actually allowed us, I have a microscope now that you couldn't have 20, 30 years ago to look at those organisms. So the earth, to me, is a model. And this may sound a little coarse, but when we look at our own gut, it's the same business going on there. And when you look at consciousness and balance in the unconscious and the conscious and the communication between the two, the mycorrhizae in the earth are what is linking everything that is alive. I mean, there is a massive communication going on under the ground. So it's a very exciting time. And I think you could hear it if you put your ear to the earth. And if we didn't spray and kill things that we need, there's a whole movement going across the world in the area of soil regeneration, where they are taking dead plots of land where they have been sprayed with herbicide, with things like Roundup, and they have regenerated with compost and brought all of this alive again. And there are YouTube videos and some wonderful scientists working on these things. So
I've typed into the chat over there. There's a documentary. Has anyone seen this called Kiss the Ground? It's a documentary about exactly what Florine's talking about. It's really very hopeful. Have you seen it, Florine?
Yes, I have. It's wonderful.
And it shows how the earth can regenerate itself.
Whoops, I hit a wrong button.
Anyway, I don't remember what streaming network that's. I don't know if it's on Amazon or Netflix or something, but it's called Kiss the Ground. It'll make you feel a lot better about the climate crisis.
And just check YouTube with the subject in general. You will be pleasantly surprised. And there are some really good scientists that are world renowned. It isn't woo-woo stuff. And so anyway.
And Lynn had a question.
I just was going to observe not to diminish at all the role of the unconscious soul of the earth, but that I think our consciousness and connected consciousnesses among people plays an important role in this rebalancing as well.
Absolutely.
That was a
great observation. Thank you. Did somebody else have their hand up a minute ago? Well, we've got just a few more minutes. Is there anyone who hasn't gotten a chance to say on any subject related to this discussion or this book? Anything you found particularly enlightening or helpful, or anything you want to say about it? I think it's a book. I know one person who wasn't able to be here today, but she's been enjoying reading it. One thing I liked about this book is you can just pick it up and read an excerpt, like one a day or something. I mean, you don't have to read this front to cover. And a lot of the same ideas are expressed over and over again because the editor looks for examples of this one concept. So, but I thought the editor, frankly, did a remarkable job of combing through not only the over 20-something books of Jung's collected works, but letters and speeches he gave, but letters, like some of the very personal letters to his wife. I mean, you do get a totally different kind of viewpoint when you can read his personal. Some of this, I'm sure he never intended to be published, but anyway.
Adele, Adele, before we leave, what about mentioning the idea of getting Anna Dudley from the Birmingham Jung group, who's working in the Jung Institute on a fairy tale, and her session that she had on solstice, shaman and Santa, it ties into our discussion today because it talks about the very, very ancient roots of man's difficult challenge of understanding that when there's the darkness of solstice in the wintertime, that there is a pathway out. And so there were the shamans, people of some other kind of wisdom who could help direct, well, if we're in this dark cycle now, we'll come back to the March 20th cycle where there's rebirth. And I think you had a good idea to have her bring that presentation. Would be fascinating for our group here in Nashville.
But Michael and I both watched. There is a group, and any of you can, if you like doing these things, it's called Friends of Jung South, and it's a Birmingham group, and they offer a number of free monthly talks, and we both zoomed in on one that was back in December that kind of talked about the shamans as being the forerunners of the Santa Claus myth. And anyway, I sort of send out these newsletters now quarterly, kind of based on those season changes, because I think that is a way for us to be kind of in rhythm with the earth and just more attuned to these times of the equinox and the autumnal equinox, and then the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And more people, I think, are trying, sort of celebrating those.
Should I put up the slide, Linda, Adele, the one single slide of the Siberian shaman?
Sure.
And you know it, here, I'll put it here now as a share. And
also Alan had a comment he wanted to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I was going to say, it feels really good to actually hug a tree. I tried that the other day, and it felt really good.
That's great.
I guess what I was going to say is, maybe this is obvious, and I brought it up in our little discussion group, but your relationship to the unconscious, or society's relationship to its collective unconscious, is directly reflected in its attitude towards nature. Is it safe to say that? Can we make that is that an appropriate sort of blanket statement, or is it more complicated than that?
Say that one more time. Would you say it again?
Yes.
Yeah. An individual or an individual's relationship to their own unconscious, or a society's relationship to the collective unconscious, is directly reflected in their attitude towards nature.
I think that's true, because I think the unconscious is nature. Our unconscious, my unconscious is my connection to nature. Like my soul is nature.
Yeah.
Well, it's true if we are aware, if we know that we are part of nature, that we're part of the whole thing. If we're not thinking of ourselves as being separate, which has been a problem for a lot of people. Yeah, I would agree with that there.
they say, a lot of people are like, consider themselves from here up,
Yeah.
And, we had some earlier sessions back in the fall about embodiment, which to me is another way of getting in touch with your body, is certainly a way of getting in touch with your, nature and your animal nature. So, it's interesting when you said about hugging the trees, Alan, and thinking about this age of Aquarius. Those of us old enough, I think a lot of us remember the 60s. All of these things were in at that time, and and hippies were
Yes.
growing their own food and farming and worried, and there's all the environmental emphasis and hugging trees, and then it all kind of went underground, it seemed like, for a little while, and now it's kind of back. So
Yeah. There's I feel like there are just these reiterations and these good ideas always come back in a new form, though, or a refined form, or you understand the reasons for why they're coming back. You bring into consciousness the actual drives, the more important first principles under the action. I understand why I'm hugging the tree, and it's more than just. I feel like it's a psychological ritual act, not just some sort of idealistic, hippie thing.
Yeah, no, it is.
And you may be doing it cold sober.
Yeah. No, I'm not even stoned. I'm just completely sober doing that.
Some of you may remember this better than I do, but I think Tarnis said that there's something astrologically similar about now and in the 60s. It's a little bit of a different angle between the same two planets, I think, but I don't remember exactly.
I do think there's real effort involved here in working on the inside aspect, as we talked about before, on the subject. I mentioned in our small little group, but that I have to it's almost a process of subtraction. I had a very, when I was, and I'm talking about not like in my teenage years as a hippie years, but rather as a kid, that I was, non-verbally communicating with trees and with nature all the time. And I remember that it is now as an adult, it feels like faking it now when I hug a tree. But because there's so much in between, there's so much it has arisen in during adulthood, and all the learned stuff gets in the way. And I think that's what the book is very much about. And that there is, as Ellen suggested, there's an effort involved here. It's almost like we have to practice to meditate. So we have to practice to remove ourselves, or letting some of this accumulated knowledge or whatever, put it aside. Literally learning how to put it aside for a while, because it is obviously very helpful and it's all very good, but not all the time, and not when it is literally ruling us, because it takes us away from what and who we really are. And that is part of the whole thing. I mentioned also that Alan Watts, the guy, said, the definition of man is not just, we are a man. We are an organism environment, because we could not exist with our environment, and the environment is nature. So we are part of it, and it's part of us. There's no separating. And the minute we separate it, we are disconnected. And I think that is where the suffering starts.
That's beautifully put.
Yeah.
I'm going to go hug a tree.
I
think the phrase "fake it till you make it" is way underrated.
Yes, that's right.
We're talking about hugging trees, and one of the hopeful signs of to me, this change that's coming about of awareness of nature are these books, like The Hidden Life of Trees. Isn't that a book? And then there was a book that won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago, The Overstory. It's a novel about and there was a story about that woman that book was based on, who has written extensively about trees and how the trees communicate with each other underground from their root systems. And I don't know.
There's actually an album that didn't get much attention by Stevie Wonder, The Secret Life of Plants. For anybody who hasn't checked that out, it's a pretty amazing stuff. But it was so unlike what Stevie Wonder did before. I think it's also interesting to realize that he wrote this stuff in being a blind person. Something about that is fascinating. I mean, it's now. I think it came out in the early '80s, but it's a pretty amazing. If anybody is interested in audio stuff, so.
Gerd, to your point earlier, my granddaughter's been to a forest school, and I understand that forest schools were popular in Germany 100 years ago, and being brought out all the time out in nature, stepping around through the water and with rubber boots on and so forth. But it sounded very much like what you talked about when you were young.
Yeah, well, those are, I mean, look, there have been these movements back to nature over and over and over, but that were usually apprehended, or let's say caught by some political movements, and where then I do not know how they started, to be honest. But they have been around. Yeah, I don't think that I was part of it. I'm talking. This was just a thing that, as I read from in this book, that had to do with this connection. It was just there naturally. It was part of the tapping as a kid, as we are. There is no, how it's sensations. It's like through our senses that we connect with nature and the outside world. And also as kids, we have no sense of, initially, we don't have a sense of being an individual person, right? We always think of ourselves as, a third person. We talk almost about ourselves in the third person, Gerd wants a little, ice cream, whatever, and it takes a while. You suddenly realize, I'm a separate entity here. So that, I think that was there before I learned anything. I shared in our group that I'm trying to reconnect with that by reading old fairy tales, because there are some of these archetypes in these characters in the fairy tales, and I try to make myself sort of re-experience it again, because it's there. I don't know. It's a big gap there, and a lot of stuff that accumulated in the middle, as I said.
Jungians don't know anything about fairy tales, do they?
I love them. I love Hauf. Boy, do I love Hauf. So there we go. I want to thank Adele.
Go ahead.
Adele, I just want to thank you. I think this was very. I've so missed having missed the first part of the book. I've got the book though. I'm 1/3 through. I'll finish it. I really, truly enjoyed this today.
Well, we're so glad. Thank you. And then so you'll know, Karen's discussion that she led on the first half of the book is taped, and is it up on our YouTube channel yet? Do you know? So we do have a YouTube channel. If you just Google Nashville Jung Circle YouTube, it should pull up a link. And a number of our programs for the last 6 months or so, we've been taping them and putting them up. So
will do.
So Karen's discussion of the first half of the book should be up there soon, if it may already be. So, well, thank everyone. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and hope you'll join us next month to talk about dreams, and then join us in May to talk about blues and the archetypes in the music. So,
thank you, Linda, for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Happy spring.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.